This video is going to be long enough. We don't got time for jokes. Hello and welcome to the Durin 101. This video has been a long time coming and I have been thinking about making it ever since Durin's initial release. Durin is one of my favorite designs to come out for this game in a good amount of time, and his flexibility provides him with so many different team options. But before we go deeper into talking about Durin himself, we do have to address a bit of an elephant in the room, that being Nicole. Nicole is going to be an incredibly impactful unit for Durin. For a lot of reasons that we're going to go into, Nicole is an interesting and powerful teammate for Durin, but as of recording this video, she's not out yet, so I'm not going to be able to get any footage of her in this video. Rest assured, I will be talking about her a lot. Once we finish talking about Durin's kit, I'm going to do a small section talking about what Nicole does and why she is going to be a generically useful teammate for Durin in a lot of different teams. But also, as we go through all the different teams that I'm going to talk about today, I'll also mention if Nicole would be a particularly powerful inclusion into any given team. I'll likely also be making a shorter follow-up video once Nicole actually comes out. Because this is made before Nicole's release, inevitably I'm going to miss some things, so look out for that video if you want to hear a little bit more about her. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the kit. While I'm going to be taking a long time to talk about all of Durin's teams and how Nicole might potentially slot into a lot of those teams, fortunately I get to save a little bit of time talking about his kit because it is really simple. Starting with the basics, Durin is of course a Pyro unit and a sword wielder, and he is primarily designed as an off-fielder. Because he is designed as an off-fielder, his normals aren't particularly impactful. I would say most people are fine leaving these at level 1, but as we'll go over later, Durin actually has pretty good potential to be on-fielded, and for his on-field playstyles, his normals do represent a reasonable portion of his damage and should be leveled. But that's kind of a gimmick thing, so let's not get caught up in that. Let's look at the actual kit. Let's talk about his skill. Pressing his skill puts Durin into the essential transmutation state, and while this initial cast doesn't do any damage of its own, all that the essential transmutation state does is give Durin 2 more options for dealing damage. Pressing E again will make Durin fly into the air and slam back down onto the ground, dealing some AoE damage when he hits. Your second option is to instead do a normal attack. Durin will send a little fiery claw forward and deal 3 instances of damage whenever it hits. Let's get an actual target to test this against, and you can see the tap version does 1 hit, and the normal attack version does 3 hits. And both forms generate 4 particles whenever they hit an enemy. Now, while I do have this talent crowned, you're able to see that even with that level 10 talent and a pretty decent build, his skill doesn't do very much damage of its own. That's because that's not its primary purpose. Looking at my burst icon here, whether you use the skill or normal attack variant of his skill not only changes how the ability will deal damage, but it determines what form Durin's burst will take. Using the skill variant gets you this icon, which I will be calling light Durin mode, and using a normal attack gets you this icon, which I will be calling evil and f***ed up Durin mode. Before we look at his burst and we talk about the actual differences between those 2 different modes, there's one final thing that his skill does. Regardless of the form you choose, whenever you hit an enemy with the damage that his skill does, he gives himself a stupid amount of flat energy generation. Let's just do a quick demonstration so you guys know what it looks like because I've been at full energy this entire time. Wabam. Meaty chunk of energy before he even catches his particles. It starts at a pretty measly 6 energy, but you gain 3 extra flat energy per talent level. Durin's kit is almost entirely contained within his burst, so if you don't have enough energy to cast it, he basically does nothing. So leveling this talent so that Durin's skill grants him extra flat energy lets you get your burst up a lot more consistently and makes it so you have to build less energy recharge and can build more of whatever desirable stat you would rather be building. So even though it doesn't deal very much damage, the massive amount of energy that his skill has the potential to give makes it worth leveling. I would suggest at least to level 9. You don't have to go so far as to crown it like I have, but Durin has a lot of different teams where he can have widely varying ER needs, but leveling this skill will reduce those needs in every single team he's played in and allow him to deal a bit more damage. Even though the hits of the skill itself don't deal very much damage, his skill talent levels do represent meaningful damage coming from Durin, because every single level on his skill giving him an extra bit of energy generation makes it so that he has to build less energy recharge and can build other desirable damaging stats. So while you don't have to crown his skill like I have, I would recommend that you get it to level 9 at the bare minimum level 8. Now, let's talk about the burst. First, let's talk about the light mode, because that is what Durin uses in like 85% of his teams. I very rarely play evil and f***ed up mode Durin, and if I wasn't a content creator, I'd play it even less than I do. Anyways, light mode. Both of his bursts deal 3 instances of pyro damage upon casting it, and the baseline multiplier of a level 10 burst is 170%. He does have a passive that affects his scalings, but we'll get into that when we talk about the passive. Now let's look at his other burst. In comparison, evil and f***ed up mode Durin, it hits at a slower rate than light mode at 1.25 seconds instead of 1 second, although it does have the same every other hit application rule, which means that evil mode Durin applies pyro every 2.5 seconds instead of 2 seconds, which actually is a fair bit slower, and its damage is mostly single target. There is a small AoE whenever it hits an enemy, but that AoE is often too small to really reliably hit multiple enemies. Maybe you can get it to hit reliably if you have some particularly good grouping, but evil mode Durin tends to not run groupers in his teams. It's definitely possible, but it's not something that is going to come easily. To make up for the fact that evil mode Durin hits slower, applies pyro slower, and has a smaller AoE, each individual hit of evil mode burst does a significant amount more damage. 230% compared to the 170 of the light mode. Around a 35% increase in its motion value. If those were all of the differences between Durin's 2 bursts, I actually would recommend that you use his evil mode a lot more often, because even though it hits slower, the extra damage is enough to make up for it, and its worse AoE rarely matters in most of the endgame content that we get. We get a lot of single target, we get a lot of bosses, so who cares if you're hitting in a larger circle? But those aren't the only differences between Durin's 2 bursts. His A1 passive gives each burst a far greater identity of its own. When his burst is in light mode, any character triggering any pyro reaction that isn't vaporize or melt will shred res for both elements involved in the reaction by 20%. Just to go over them all of them will shred pyro res, but burning shreds dendro res, overloaded gets electro res, pyro swirls do animo res, and pyro crystallizes do geo res. And his evil mode burst picks up the slack on those last 2 elements and gives him a massive 40% buff to his vaporize and melt damage. Effectively, this just gives him a bunch of EM that will only work when he's triggering either vaporize or melt. For reference, let's just throw him on an Elemental Mastery Sans, and now he gets 32.7% extra damage bonus towards his vaporizes and melts. So this passive gives him a little bit more than a Sans worth of EM for his vaporize and melt damage specifically. This passive defines the purpose of each of Durin's bursts a lot more. We have the supportive light mode that hits faster, applies more pyro for use in reactions, has better AoE capabilities, and of course has the potential to shred res. Meanwhile, the evil mode of his burst is much more focused on making Durin deal the damage himself. It has slower hits with higher individual values, so you can keep up your proper application so that Durin can get the reactions and get big vaporizes and melts. It's also pretty notable that this vaporize and melt damage aren't exclusive to his burst damage. He just gets this passive across the board. So if you can get his normals infused and get those vaporized or melting, they also have the potential to benefit from this big damage boost, which is part of what makes him a potentially good on-fielder. So there we go. We have our 2 different bursts. We have light mode, deals less damage, hits faster, shreds res, and we have dark mode, which is hits slower, doesn't do any supportive capabilities, but deals a lot more damage. Which is why why light mode Durin is the Durin you're going to be using about 85% of the time. Dark mode Durin often needs very specific teams that are catering towards his strengths to make him deal a lot of damage, while light mode Durin is the support himself, and he sets up other units to be dealing damage, and he can therefore be used in a much wider variety of teams. Now, his final Ascension passive, although it's not the final passive we're going to talk about, there's a big lot of complicated wording here, but basically what it means is that when Durin uses his burst, he will get 10 stacks of an effect that increases the base damage of his burst. So when it says a maximum of 75% additional damage can be dealt this way, he's not getting 75% damage bonus, and he's not adding a flat 75% to his scalings here. He is getting an additional multiplicative 75% damage on these scalings. An additional 75% scaling increases this 230% multiplier to a 408% multiplier. It almost doubles the motion value of his burst and makes it hit much harder. Granted, he doesn't get that full boost on every hit of his burst. I very quickly mentioned at the beginning of talking about this talent is that he gains 10 stacks of this effect. Only the first 10 hits of his burst will get their damage boosted by this talent. This has the effect of front-loading Durin's damage so that he deals most of his burst damage earlier into a rotation, which is likely when most of your buffs are going to be active. This buff scales on his own attack and caps out at 2500 and makes it so that attack has pretty comparable value to damage bonus before he hits that 2500 threshold. Granted, it has become much easier to hit that passive's cap since Durin's release. Not only does he now have a set that gives him a bunch of extra attack percent, but by the time of this video coming out, he will have Nicole, who is a full party attack buffer. So in a lot of teams that Durin is played in, you are likely going to be able to use a Pyro damage bonus goblet and still be able to easily hit that 2500 attack cap. But if you are in a team where after all of your buffs, Durin still doesn't hit 2500 attack percent goblets can be very worth considering on him. One final thing before I move on, I don't want you guys to over focus on that 2500 cap. You shouldn't prioritize attack over any other stat until you hit 2500, and likewise, you shouldn't completely stop building attack after you hit that 2500 mark. Other stats still have value before that cap, and attack still has value after that cap. Now, final passive, which is where we are going to be opening the floodgates, is his Hexerai passive. Most of you probably already know this, but for the sake of thoroughness, let's just go through it. In tune with Hoyo's recent design of making factions that require you to put 2 units of the same faction in a team for both of those units to get a benefit, Durin is of the Hexerai faction. Including another Hexerai unit in the team increases the values on his A1 passive by 75%. Now, that's not to say he's getting 95 res shred and 115 vaporize and melt damage bonus. It's a multiplicative 75%. Just like the one from his A4 passive. 75% of 20 is 15%, leading to a total of 35% res shred in double hex teams, and 75% of 40 is 30, leading to a total of 70% vaporize and melt damage bonus in hex teams. These are pretty good values, and Durin does run other hex units in all of his best teams, but he is far from hex reliant. He does not need it to function. He will be a little bit less effective if you don't run another hex unit, but he still applies Pyro at the same rate. He still deals a pretty similar amount of damage. He still has the same energy needs. His kit isn't completely bricked if you don't bring a second hex unit, unlike some other units that will go unnamed. And then final passive, he gets extra stuff from Mondstadt expeditions. Yippee. Hooray. Rocks from Mondstadt. And that's it with the kit, but before I get into team building, I have 2 final things that I need to talk about. I actually have to reopen the menu, so I don't know why I closed it. Many people see this passive and see that, okay, when you trigger a reaction, Durin will shred res, and they assume it means if you put a unit of any one of these elements in the team, Durin will automatically shred res for Pyro and their element. That is not true, because as I mentioned, you do not get any res shred for triggering vaporizes or melts. I've seen people play teams like this thinking, oh, well, Navi is a Geo unit and Durin can shred Geo res, so he will shred Geo res in this team, but that's not necessarily the case. Alright, don't look at the damage because the team's not properly geared. Because Durin specifically needs Pyro reactions to shred res, you can't get Res Shred off of a Hydro Crystallize. Because of the Hydro Farina is applying, it's very difficult to get a Pyro Aura onto your enemy for Navia to then crystallize. You can see I do get some uptime with my Res Shred. I occasionally am triggering a Pyro Crystallize, but it's pretty low uptime and it doesn't always match up with Navia being on field. Because Durin doesn't shred any res when you trigger a melt or a vaporize, Cryo and Hydro have the potential to get in your way and mess with your reactions and your auras, and make it so that you aren't actually shredding the res that you want to shred. So while in teams that don't have any Hydro or Cryo, Durin pretty much shreds res for all elements involved automatically, if you do put Hydro and Cryo units in your team, you have to consider how they will affect your elemental auras and how they might stop you from getting the reactions that you want to get the res shred that you want. Now that that's done, let's talk about Nicole. Nicole is pretty clearly made to be a step up for Durin in particular. Nicole is a Pyro unit, a Hexarai unit, and a full party attack buffer, and that is kind of all you need to know why she will be good for Durin. She is a full party attack buffer, and Durin is an off-field attack scaling damage dealer, so obvious synergy there. She is a Hexarai unit, so she enables Durin to have higher res shred or damage bonus depending on the form that he's in. And she is a Pyro unit, which activates Pyro Resonance, which isn't too bad. That's another source of full party attack. But additionally, one thing I didn't mention is that her burst is questionably usable. It's really only any good at all if you're using a Hexarai on-fielder, and even if you are using a Hexarai on-fielder, it's not the best burst in the world. It deals elemental damage of the on-field unit's type without applying any extra element, and it gets a pretty big buff from using a Hexarai on-fielder, but its initial numbers are so low that if you aren't using a Hexarai on-fielder, it's kind of not even worth it to cast, which means that those 5 juicy particles that Nicole generates can all go straight to Durin. The best teams will run Hexarai on-fielders, but they have many good options that don't use Hexarai on-fielders. And in all of those teams, Nicole is not only going to be a Pyro unit that gives resonance, an attack buffer that gives attack, a Hexarai unit that enables Durin's higher res shred, a Hexarai unit that enables the full effect of the upcoming set, but also she will be a particularly good battery for him. And there we go. That's the final thing that I have to talk about regarding Nicole. It's not really a part of Nicole's kit, but this is going to be the set that Nicole is on all the time. Celestial Gift is the Hexarai buffing set. It has to be equipped on a Hexarai character. The base effect is that it gives a 20% team-wide damage bonus of the user's elemental type whenever they use a skill. Even if Durin wasn't a second Hexarai unit, that would be an automatic 20% damage bonus to him, given that they're the same element. But he is another Hex unit, so he also enables the double Hex version of that set, which increases that baseline 20% damage bonus to 40% damage bonus, and also grants an additional 40% damage bonus of the element of the on-fielder's type. Talking about this set provides me a great segue, because if you're running a Nicole Durin team, Nicole will pretty much always be the one on that new set, but that set is more than usable on Durin himself. Let's move into artifacts. I would say that Durin basically has 3 main options. Daykar from Rising Winds is obviously your DPS set, while you have 2 supportive options in the upcoming Celestial Gift and in Noblesse. Exactly which set you run on Durin is going to be heavily dependent on the exact team that you're running and what you want out of that team. Rising Winds being the damage-oriented set, obviously you want to be playing him in teams where he is dealing a lot of the team's damage. Obviously this is what you use in on-field Durin teams. If you're running Lohen Durin teams, Lohen is of course going to be an interesting unit for Durin, as his purpose is to deal a little bit of cryo damage on field and apply cryo for Durin to melt off of. In Lohen Durin teams, Durin ends up dealing about 50% if not more of the team's damage, so Rising Winds is kind of a no-brainer there. And I think also Varka Premium currently calcs the highest when Durin is on Rising Winds. Your general setup will be Varka and Durin on Rising Winds, Nicole on the supportive Hex set, Celestial Gift, and Prune, C6 Prune on VV. Prune doesn't need C6 to function, but she does need C6 to be better than Venti in the slot. which is why I'm saying C6 prune. And this kind of provides me another good segue, because that is an example of a team where it calcs the best if Durin is on Rising Winds, because he's getting buffs from Nicole, he's getting buffs from Prune, so him and Varka are both dealing a significant amount of the team's damage. But maybe if you just want to configure the team a little bit more towards Varka dealing damage, you can trade out Rising Winds for Noblesse, because nobody else is holding it in the team. The 2-piece set effect, giving 20% damage bonus to Elemental Burst, is a pretty good 2-piece effect for Durin, given that almost all of his damage is burst damage. And the 4-piece set effect, giving a full party 20% attack buff, that combines supportive and offensive utility for Durin. Not only can you give an attack buff to your on-fielders and other off-fielders, but he gives it to himself. 20% attack is also a little bit higher than normal 2-piece attack percent sets, 18%. Although a 2-piece effect would of course be full uptime, whereas Noblesse has a 12-second duration. Given that Durin has pretty long uptime, his burst lasts for 20 seconds, he generally goes pretty early into your rotations, and this attack buff can expire by the time you start dealing more damage with your on-fielder. But, as we talked about before, Durin's damage is front-loaded. He gets this 75% additional motion value on his first 10 hits of his burst. So, all of his highest damaging, most impactful hits are getting buffed by Noblesse. Now, the final option of Celestial Gift, the base effect of 4-piece Heaven's Gift is a little bit numerically low and inflexible. 20% damage bonus to the entire team, only based on the element of the equipper. So you generally do want to be running a second Hex unit so you can get that full 40% buff and also buff the element of your on-fielder, if they are a different element than the equipping unit. You generally do want to be running a second Hex unit to get the full value of the set, and because the only offensive stats given by Celestial Gift are given to the entire team, you generally will want to put Celestial Gift on the unit that is dealing the least personal damage in the team, which is why you usually put it on Nicole, because she doesn't deal any personal damage of her own. Because of those two things, you want to be running Celestial Gift in double Hex, and you want to be putting it on the character who's contributing the least damage in the team. It is pretty rare that Durin will ever be the one who ends up on Celestial Gift. There will pretty much always be another Hexerai unit in the team if you're using that set, and because Durin deals pretty significant damage of his own, it's also likely that that other unit will deal less damage than him, and therefore be the optimal choice for the set. Off the top of my head, the only real example I can think of for Gift Durin is if you're playing Varka's current premium team without Nicole, Varka, Venti, Bennett, Durin. Yes, Venti does deal less damage than Durin in that team, but Venti has another very good supportive set that he should be using. So by putting Celestial Gift on him, you'll be giving up VV, which is pretty significant. And because it attracts the element of the equipper and the on-fielder, it means that it will only be buffing Animo damage in that team, and a C0 Varka does not do majority Animo damage. If we assume that Bennett is on Noblesse, then all we're losing by putting Durin on Celestial Gift is a little bit of personal damage from Rising Winds, while giving the entire team a 40% damage bonus buff. There are definitely more examples that I just can't think of right now, but in general, I would say you usually will have another unit on your team that should be equipping Celestial Gift before Durin does. But in those edge cases, like I mentioned with Varka, Venti, Durin, Bennett, there definitely are use cases for it. So to recap artifacts, Rising Winds is his obvious damaging set, Noblesse is a pretty good combination DPS and buffing set that you can use in a lot of different teams if you want to configure a team to make an on-fielder deal more damage, and Celestial Gift is a usable option, but generally Durin won't be the one equipping it. Okay, so I somehow got through that entire section without mentioning energy recharge, but Durin is a burst-reliant unit and he has some energy needs. He's especially weird because not only do those energy needs depend on the exact team that you're playing him in, but they depend on the level of his skill. You have units like Venti and Raiden who give a bunch of flat energy, and in combination with his skill can reduce his energy needs to as low as 110%. But in your regular teams that don't have any other sources of flat energy generation, I would say that a crown Durin generally varies between needing 140% energy recharge at the low end and 160% at the high end. I also heard a figure a while back when Durin first released that each level of his skill was worth 10% energy recharge. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and use that as an exact figure. I think that's a gross oversimplification. Again, he has a lot of different ways to relieve his energy needs, and his needs vary a lot from team to team in general. But using that as a bit of a general guideline, you can shoot for that 140 to 160 target and add on an additional 10% energy recharge per level of skill that you have below level 10. Alright, back to live Mies. Now, let's talk about weapons. For once, I can actually show off a signature weapon, but I still don't have much to say about it. It's his signature. There are a few things to bring up. It is kind of interesting. Its passive effect gives a 16% crit damage buff to elemental bursts, and its active effect effectively gives you tenacity but with bursts. When the user hits with a burst, they get a 20% attack buff for 3 seconds, and they give a 16% attack buff to your on-fielder. And those 20% and 16% attack buffs are a tiny bit low, but just like with his A1 buff, they get a 75% buff when you are in a double hex team, bringing the 20% to, again, 35%, and the 16% to 28% attack. This does put a little bit more value into running double hex with Durin. Between this weapon, the res shred, and our upcoming set, you are likely going to be using Durin in double hex teams the large majority of the time, but it absolutely still is a usable weapon outside of double hex. I still use it all the time. It's a little bit suboptimal, but it's still quite a good option. One last funny thing that I do want to talk about with his weapon is that because part of the passive is tied up in giving a buff to your on-fielder and not the equipper of the weapon, it actually loses a fair bit of value in on-field Durin teams when you can't pass this buff to any other character, because it does have the stipulation nearby active party members other than the equipping character will get that 16% buff. Now that we're done with that, let's talk about his other weapon options. 5-star stat sticks or 5-star stat sticks. They're all pretty good. If you have one of them, just pick it and use it. He has the potential to get full value out of Mist Splitter, so that actually makes it a pretty decent option on him in on-field teams. Quite competitive with his signature, but that's only really in on-field Durin teams because you need to deal normal attack elemental damage, so he needs an infusion. Anyways, 5 stars are boring. Let's talk about 4 stars, because he actually does have a lot of pretty decent options in 4 stars. Doing a step down in investment, Wolffang, the Battle Pass weapon, is a pretty solid option on him. It has the effect of giving either elemental skill or elemental burst crit rate for a little bit when either one of them hits. Combining the crit rate substat, the crit rate passive, and the crit rate from Rising Winds if you have it equipped, he can get a lot of free crit rate and make it a little bit difficult to not overcap. This weapon has a little bit of anti-synergy because it doesn't actually work off field. You need to be on field hitting with your skill or your burst to increase either of their crit rate, and each stack only lasts 10 seconds, so you won't get full uptime. But Durin has a few things in his kit that make him work a little bit better with Wolffang. First off, he front loads his hits when he's on field, dealing 3 instances of damage on cast, and probably another one immediately after before you get a chance to swap off. That grants him all 4 stacks that Wolffang can possibly give. Additionally, even though he doesn't get full uptime on those stacks, they only last 10 seconds, as we talked about before, his damage is front-loaded, so even though Wolffang's crit rate stacks expire halfway through your rotation, so does this passive, so Durin was going to be dealing a lot less damage regardless. It is far more important that your buffs are active for the first 10 hits of your burst, where this passive is buffing those hits, and Wolffang is able to do that. So if you pick up a Battle Pass, Durin actually does have pretty decent synergy with Wolffang, even though it doesn't work off field. But let's talk about some of the options for people who don't do any spending. Finale of the Deep is as simple as it gets. It's a big stupid stat stick, it gives a bunch of attack. And then I spent way too long talking about Finale of the Deep. It's a fine weapon, it gives Durin a lot of attack, that's nice, but it needs a lot of refines to be decent, and it needs a healer to really be great, and Durin doesn't have the best time slotting healers into his teams. Considering how good an R1 Moonweaver's Dawn is, and considering you can get a Moonweaver's Dawn completely for free by doing a world quest, I don't really think it's worth investing the billets to use a Finale of the Deep. But if you have one laying around and you have a healer in your team, team, that's also a very good weapon option for Durin. And now we have Amenoma. Amenoma does have a pretty significantly worse stat line, having a low base attack with a high attack percent substat, but it still is a weapon that gives you a decent chunk of attack, and its passive doesn't give any attack, but it does grant 12 energy at R5. If you don't care that much about Durin's damage and you want to use him more as a supportive unit, Amenoma sacrifices his damage in exchange for basically making his burst completely free. Between the 12 energy that an R5 Amenoma gives and the 33 energy that a crowned talent gives, Durin's 70 cost burst is reduced to 25. 25 energy. That is absolutely nothing and can be met with next to no ER substats. The one annoying thing about Amenoma is that it does require you to cast your burst to consume your succession seeds and give you your energy. So in Stygian, it doesn't help you get your first burst faster, but this is still a nice weapon that I would recommend for ease of use. And the final weapon that I almost forgot about, Moonweaver's Dawn, has a better stat line with a high base attack, just like Finale of the Deep has. And while he doesn't benefit at all from this part of the passive, he does get a baseline 20% elemental burst damage, and this thing's completely free. To get refinements on it, you do have to go on gacha banners, which that kind of sucks, and this only gets particularly good if you do have refinements on it, but this is a weapon that can be attained through world quests and Nod Cry, and it's a pretty solid stat stick on him. This is kind of your baseline free-to-play investment option on him. An R1 Moonweaver's Dawn gives you a very similar amount of damage as an R5 Finale of the Deep without having healed the Bond of Life away. If you have a healer in your team to make Finale of the Deep work, then you do need a few refines on Moonweaver's Dawn to make it pull ahead. Is that it? I think that's it. I think it's team time. And you know who's coming first. You know who's coming first. Durin was pretty obviously made as a custom support for Varka. Varka has all these restrictions where he wants an Animo unit and 2 other units of the same element. Durin comes along as a Pyro Res Shredder. He deals a little bit of damage of his own. He helps Varka meet his double hex incentives. He shreds res for both Pyro and Animo, the 2 main sources of damage in the team. And of course, because he's Pyro, he pairs quite well with Bennett, soon to be Nicole. Not really much to talk about, given that you just kind of set up, and then Varka hits stuff. That's the whole team. Varka hits stuff. Durin helps him meet his team restrictions while also being a pretty good sub DPS and support. What else can I say? I guess it's probably most appropriate to just talk about how Nicole will impact things. Essentially, Nicole is going to sacrifice a little bit of attack buffing to your on-fielder, in this case Varka, to make that attack buff team-wide, so of course it affects Durin, and the upcoming Prune, who will be replacing Lanyan here, which I'm currently using Lanyan just because I think she feels good in the slot. She can hold TDDS, she can hold VV, she gives Varka a shield. Varka really likes a shield, which is another thing that Nicole will be providing, because not only does she provide an attack buff to the rest of your team that might want it, but her attack buff is not circle impacted, it's not energy reliant, and she creates a shield upon giving it. So once Prune and Nicole come out, Varka himself actually won't be dealing very much more damage than he is right now, but the rest of his team will be dealing more damage, and he will be a lot comfier and easier to play. You won't have to worry about circle impact, you won't have to worry about bringing another shielder, you won't have to worry about funneling all of your energy into Bennett because Nicole has much better particle generation, generates 5 particles whenever she uses her skill, as compared to Bennett's either 2 or 3 randomly. She won't necessarily be a big increase to Varka himself, but she will be to the rest of his team and to his comfort. And for people who aren't playing perfectly, which is probably you. I also don't play perfectly. I didn't do perfect rotations or perfect Varka combos there. Nicole is going to be a lot more forgiving by the nature of her not being circle impact and having a longer lasting buff, which I didn't mention. But Nicole buff lasts 20 seconds compared to Bennett's 14. So while Nicole's introduction doesn't result in the biggest numerical upgrade, it is going to result in a massive difference in how the team feels to play. You'll be getting more damage from off-fielders that is more consistent, and you'll be more consistent with your on-fielders because you'll have a shield and you won't have a circle to stand in. That is what Nicole's role is going to be in a lot of teams, not necessarily uplifting them massively, but making them a lot more consistent and comfortable. She will have teams that she does significantly increase the DPS of, but in practical play, she is going to be a world of difference from Bennett. Sorry, Varka, I do like you, I just don't like talking about premium teams. Now, I am a pretty big Venti fan. I do enjoy me some Venti. I do like talking about him. I do enjoy me some Venti. I do like talking about him. I do like playing him, but there's not really any more meaningful info that I can talk about with Venti that I didn't with Varka. They're very similar units that scale off of the same things. Their differences mostly come in moment-to-moment gameplay and the fact that Venti has supportive utilities while Varka does not. And Nicole doesn't really significantly impact those supportive utilities. Nicole will still be a significant upgrade to Venti teams as the full party attack buff is appreciated. Durin's got good damage. Faron doesn't have bad damage of her own. And Venti will also be a big appreciator of no circle impact and a shield. Bennett doesn't feel as bad with Venti as he does with Varka because Venti is a ranged unit. He is less affected by enemies escaping circle impact. He can simply stand in the circle and shoot away at them. He also gets a lot of damage from his burst and his skill, so his normal attack combos are a little bit less important to actually get right, so it doesn't matter if he gets interrupted as much. But Nicole will still provide a nice and cool quality of life increase to his teams. And this is the Durin 101, and I don't think I'd mentioned Durin a single time during the Venti section. Well, that's fine, because there's something else I need to talk about, which is Venti's supportive capabilities. Nicole doesn't affect them, but Durin certainly does. Venti is one of those units who has a hex requirement instead of a hex incentive. His kit does very little if you do not run him with another hex unit. When running with another hex unit, he gets a lot more damage, he gets infused normals, and he also gets a bit of a buff. On fielders who trigger a swirl reaction will get a 50% damage bonus buff. So between Durin shredding res and Venti giving an animo damage bonus buff, Venti and Durin do come together to make a pretty decent supportive core for other animo units. Venti also has the chance to support Durin back. Number one, by being a hex unit and increasing his res shred, but any hex unit can do that. The second and far more impactful thing is Venti's A4 passive. Grants 15 energy to any party members who match the element that Venti's burst absorbed. Durin makes it pretty easy to get a consistent Pyro absorption. And therefore, that's just an extra 15 energy to Durin. Like we were talking about with Amenoma, getting any additional source of flat energy makes Durin's burst cost next to nothing. With Venti in the team, if you get a Pyro absorption, Durin's burst cost is comically low. In particular, I've played a good amount of DPS Aoife, and while I do love him very, very, very much, he's not particularly great. So while you do have the obvious animo supportive option of Faron, I've found that I prefer Venti Durin cores much more than I do Faron, although if I really want to, I can just play all these characters together. Faron's power is much more concentrated in her buffs, whereas both Venti and Durin have significant personal damage of their own while also giving buffs. Aoife is just frankly not all that powerful, so I've found the teams that combine supportive utility with off-field damage dealers perform better than the teams that go all in on buffing Aoife's damage. Let's just run a little DPS comparison. Aoife and Bennett are going to be on both teams, but Venti and Durin are going to be swapped out for Faron and Farina. Now, I do have a little bit of vertical investment in my Venti and my Durin. I have both of their weapons, so for this showcase, I swapped them out. Durin's on Wolffang, Venti's on Skyward Harp. Should make the comparison to Farina and Faron a little bit more fair. All right, there we go. 55k. Again, as with any DPS showcase in my videos or any other videos, don't take it like 100% seriously. This 54k DPS represents my investment and my gameplay on my account. You're likely going to get slightly different numbers depending on how you work things around. But let's now check Faron and Farina. Then I'm gonna cheat so we can just rotate cleanly. I don't have to worry that much about energy. That's another thing, is I'm doing this with infinite energy because I can't be bothered. This team seems to be settling a little bit more around 50k, so 5k less. Even though Aoife is doing a much higher proportion of the team's damage, we can see he's doing 72%. I didn't check the percentage on the last one, but it does settle a little bit lower than his variants with off-field damage dealers, because Aoife is just not built to be an on-fielder. You can on-field him with the tools that are in the game, but he just doesn't have the numbers to really hold his own. Especially with my investment in Venti and Durin, my Venti Durin team really pulls ahead of my Farina Farazan team, but I also just enjoy them more on a gameplay level. Venti's grouping can be useful from time to time, especially for Aoife. He can deal some good AoE damage if you get enemies grouped in close enough. Aoife also does technically buff swirl damage. It's not by very much. He does need his team to have active Night Soul points to buff swirl any particularly large amount. Given that he is the only Natlan unit in either of these teams, he doesn't give a bunch of Night Soul and it's constantly going down. But it is a very, very slight swirl buff, and Venti is triggering a lot of swirls. I should probably cut this part. It really doesn't matter that much. I'm kind of reaching for synergies here. So yeah, as an on-fielder, Durin and Venti don't have a bunch going on. Venti works very similarly to Varka, so there's not a bunch to talk about. But as an off-field supportive duo, they can make for an interesting supportive core for Animo units. And Venti's got his whole energy refund thing, and makes Durin Burst cost less than nothing. Now let's talk about another team that Durin definitely improved, and Nicole is only going to make better. Bam! I already made an entire video about it, but Durin was a big upscale for both Emilie and Kaniche, but I find Emilie to be a lot more relevant because she's an off-fielder that can be used to enable things, and also, I like her. Thumbs up emoji. Actually, right now, pre-Nicole, this team runs Albedo for double hex. Gets you more res shred. Albedo does his own damage. He does a little bit of buffing to the entire team. Neat thing, very cool. Already talked about it over there. This team consolidating a damage dealer and a res shredder into its pyro slot just made it feel and play so much better, and Nicole's inclusion is only going to improve that more. If you want to hear more about it, you can go check out my Emilie video. I also talk about Kaniche there, but there's pretty obvious synergy between Durin and Kaniche and Durin and Emilie, so therefore he's good for Kaniche, and Emilie is going to be showing up a lot throughout the rest of this video. But let's actually keep Albedo here for now. Albedo isn't strictly necessary for Durin to do Geo teams. You can very easily just throw Chilonin or Chiori into this slot, but I find that Albedo brings a nice combination of a few other Geo units. He's obviously dealing pretty significant damage of his own with his Hexarai buffs. He does a little bit of damage bonus buffing based on his defense, and I would generally say that you do want a second Geo unit because Geo Resonance is just so powerful for Geo units. 15% damage bonus and 20% res shred when you're protected by a shield. It's not strictly necessary, and it isn't even always optimal to do double Geo to get Geo Resonance, but Geo Resonance is one of the simplest ways to make an on-field Geo character deal more damage. And at the end of the day, you don't always have to optimize to what is the actual optimal thing to do for your entire team's DPS. You can just be happy with having your favorite guy deal a little bit more damage. Chilonin is a nice functional option that gives you a decent amount of res shred and buffing. Chiori is usually just a strict downgrade compared to Albedo, especially if you don't have her C1, because in a Navia team, you don't have any constructs being made, so she can't activate her second doll. But like Chiori could work in a potential Ito team. Any Ito fans in the comments, you can pop off for this one. But of course, Albedo is going to be one of your best options. But unlike Venti, Albedo doesn't have any sort of Geo-specific buffs going on in his kit. It is all just kind of generic damage bonuses. He deals damage himself. The only real thing he has is potentially enabling Geo Resonance, which is quite the resonance, and generating geoparticles if an on-fielder needs energy, which he's still not the best at generating geoparticles, but he's certainly better than nothing. Anyways, I haven't played this team before, so I want to do it now. I started playing and I was very, very close to reaching my burst costs, but I couldn't quite meet them, and then I realized Cora's on Viridescent Hunt instead of Fav, so we're just gonna cheat a little bit.
want some of this. Attaboy. Ha! Bam!
There we go. That was actually the correct combo, and I started inching closer and closer to 80k. I might be able to hit it if I played better. And this actually, looking at that DPS distribution, this kind of brings up a pretty good point. As far as I'm aware, I'm pretty sure Albedo is the only Hex off-fielder that consistently deals more damage than Durin, and therefore would justify Durin to be on the new Hex buffing set instead of Albedo. Because I have Durin here on a pretty good damaging build on his signature weapon, and I have Albedo on a much worse Golden Troop build. Oh my god, look at that ratio. It's really just not looking good. To be fair, this is a C1 Albedo, and I do have Spindle. Spindle is not his best weapon anymore, but it is still pretty competitive. In any case, it is a pretty optimal Durin build going up against a much less optimal Albedo build, and they're doing very similar amounts of damage. Albedo's on this bad build because Ito was taking all his husk pieces, but I think we can very easily check if we just go to check Navia in this team instead, because she don't use husk. Nah. No. It's looking like Albedo is just trailing behind Durin another time. I think that's because probably Durin got a lot more attack buffs in this team because we got Bennett on Noblesse and we've got Pyro Resonance, so he's got 45% more attack from that. But still, this is a signature Durin, so it's very impressive that Albedo kept up, and it's probable that a non-signature Durin would deal less. Let's double check that. Yeah, now that he's not sigged up, Albedo is kind of whooping Durin's ass. Again, C1 Albedo with kind of insane crazy build. Like, look at those numbers. Way better than, what was it, like 6115? At the end of the day, you gotta know your own investment, you gotta know your own builds, your own characters. Durin and Albedo deal very, very similar amounts of damage, so you are likely going to need to test for yourself to figure out which one on your account is better invested and which one should be holding the supportive set. My account, it'd probably be Durin on the supportive set, but maybe if you have a C0 Albedo, if you don't have Spindle, if you don't have a particularly good build, which it's hard to get a good build on Albedo, then it's very possible that your optimal solution might be to put him on the supportive set. Now, I've been looking at a lot of kind of dual element archetypes where there's only 2 elements in the team, and you don't care that much about the reactions happening. You're just kind of doing them to get your res shred from Durin in the first place. I've looked at Pyro Swirl, I've looked at Pyro Crystallize, I very briefly looked at Burning. If you want some more information, you can go check out the Emilie video. Now, the only one left is Overload, but Overload is interesting for 2 reasons. Number 1, it already has its own dedicated support that already does res shred. Something important I haven't mentioned yet is that res shred has some diminishing returns. Enemies have innate elemental resistance stats, and what res shred is doing is simply taking those stats and decreasing them. Most enemies start with about 10% resistance to elements that they aren't supposed to be resistant to. But after you pass 0 elemental resistance and start going into the negatives, res shred has effectively half value. So if you're going up against an enemy with 10% resistance with Durin's 20% shred, that means the first 10% of his res shred is working fine and as normal, but once you get to 0 and start dropping below, the last 10% effectively gets reduced to 5%. This makes it so that as long as your first res shredder is doing enough res shred to punch through the initial elemental resistance, bringing a second res shredder isn't the greatest idea. Durin is already here to do the res shred that matters the most, so Chevy, who comes onto the team, and a lot of her value is tied up in her res shred, all of this offensive value is halved. This doesn't mean that Chevy is getting pushed out of overload teams because she's an insane unit in her own right. Not only does she do that res shred, but she gives a full party attack buff, and at C6, she gives a damage bonus buff to your on-fielder. Chevy is still an incredible unit in overload teams, as is Durin, but generally you won't run them together. Because they reduce the value of each other's offensive buffs, you generally will pick one and use them. For characters that deal a little bit less damage of their own and would prefer to have damage coming from off-fielders, Durin is usually the play. But for characters who have their own very strong multipliers and would rather just have a few buffs, Chevy is the play. And of course, Durin has the flexibility to continue shredding res in non-full overload teams. He can res shred for non-overload elements as well. Durin's Hex teammate for this archetype is of course Fischl. She gives a pretty nice attack buff when you trigger overloads that gets kinda stupid and ridiculous at C6, so the combination of Durin and Fischl are two strong off-field damage dealers that give a fair amount of buffs between the two of them. Fischl gives up to 45% attack to your on-fielder, Durin gives 35% res shred. These two make a very strong core for units of any element to succeed. Since you already have Durin dealing off-field pyro damage and Fischl dealing off-field electro damage, you will always be getting the reactions you need, so you don't need to worry which on-field they're using, unlike with Chevra's teams, where you have to think about who is applying elements and make sure that you actually have enough application to get your consistent res shred. I don't really know that I need to do a gameplay demonstration with this team, but I guess I'm here, so why not? Just nuke the Aeon Blight Drake because I don't want to load into Miliastra. Yippee, he's dead. You guys know how overload teams work. Do I have to show you? The one final thing to talk about with overload teams is that it is the one reaction that does not get screwed over by innate auras, or rather one innate aura. Hydro, baby. People definitely knew about this before because of how good Chevra's teams were against Tulpa, but Durin effectively does the same thing. When you trigger electro-charged, it doesn't remove the elements, it lets Hydro and Electro coexist on an enemy, which means that you can react with it and still get your res shred perfectly fine. And of course, because the enemy has an innate Hydro aura, that means any pyro damage that you do will also vaporize while getting its res shredded. So yeah, Durin is very, very good at deleting Tulpa and enabling teams to delete Tulpa. But this isn't just used against enemies that have innate Hydro auras. You can also use this within the context of lunar-charged teams. Yes, Durin isn't shredding Hydro res, so there is a bit of Columbina's damage that's going unbuffed, but the majority of her damage is Electro, and this property of electro-charged allows Durin to shred Electro resistance for Flints and Anefa, and also a little bit of Pyro res shred for himself, because he can get some extra vaporizes. Sucrose is absolutely a better unit if you're going full premium with Flints, Columbina, and Anefa, but Durin is absolutely an option in lower investment Flints teams, especially in combination with Fischl, because Fischl buffs EM and attack. EM when you trigger electro-charged, attack when you trigger overloads, and you get both of those pretty easily in Flynn's Durin teams. There we go. Because Durin requires pyro reactions to shred res, Flynn's is pretty much the only lunar unit that works this well with him. Both Lunar Crystallize and Lunar Bloom would want him to trigger a Pyro Crystallize and a Burning, respectively. But to do that, you have to significantly cut down on the amount of Lunar Blooms and Lunar Crystallizes you are triggering. Because if you trigger a Burning, you have to do one Hydra application to remove it, and then ideally a second one right away to trigger another Lunar Bloom and give Nefer a Verdant Dew. But if your Pyro application is too fast and your Hydra application is too slow, like Columbina's often is, you're going to run into issues and you're not going to be able to trigger any Lunar Blooms. And for Lunar Crystallize, you'd have to be able to remove the Hydra aura completely so that Geo can react with it. And that is also going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to make you miss out on Lunar Crystallize reactions, which give Sibai Lunar Phase Shift points, and also just the reaction itself does a little bit of damage. So Durin only really functions like this with Flints or Anefa. Now, we've been looking at a lot of teams that kind of just do talent damage, and the only reason they do their reaction is to get your proper res shred. So let's look at some actual reaction-based teams. Starting off with everybody's favorite, quickburn. Given that Fischl was already as dominant as she was in aggravate teams, Durin coming along, acting as a res shredder in those teams and enabling Fischl to do a little bit more, it's safe to say he did a lot for the archetype. It's easier to play, you don't have to worry as much about any VV setups, you can get a little bit of extra reaction damage out of triggering overloads. Durin is a damage dealer himself, I haven't even mentioned that somehow. And because burning works in the way that it does, and instead of removing both elements like other reactions do, it actually adds more pyro. Burning makes it excessively easy to get your Dendro res shred, your pyro res shred, and whatever other element you might want to use. Yeah, it's not just aggravate teams that can run burning. Obviously, as I mentioned, Emilie is a very strong burning DPS that can be slotted into a lot of different teams. She can be run just fine with Animo DPSs, with Geo DPSs, of course with other burning DPSs. Often burning can be used as kind of an inoffensive reaction that doesn't mess with anything else going on. But of course with Electro units in particular, Dendro can be used to activate aggravate. This is one of Sethos' best teams right now. The only thing that competes is pretty much lunar-charged. But this is an archetype which does a lot more reaction spam, so is therefore far more suited to Sethos' strength. As I mentioned, Emilie is definitely a slot you can do here. She will increase the team's damage even more. But Nahida is an option that provides an EM buff and gets you a little bit more damage out of Sethos himself. And she can equip her signature to become a healer. I think I made this exact same joke in my original video about Durin. I'm getting deja vu. In any case, Nahida being a catalyst unit makes her a reasonable defensive slot along with the offensive buff that she provides. So while I love Emilie, I'm a little bit too skill issue to run her. Now let's butcher some Sethos gameplay.
Excuse me?
Make yourselves a home. Shadow Raven.
Into space. Sage's wisdom.
That's fine. That was played so terribly, but whatever. This team can be improved a lot with better Sethos gameplay, but this is a big video, and as much as I wish I could dedicate an hour of my life to perfecting Sethos gameplay for this one showcase, it's just not practical. So you guys are gonna have to deal with this. All right, I think my final kind of real light mode Durin team is right here, and I left it till last because it is my least favorite, but I gotta do it. It's Durgeon. Yeah, it's Durgeon. Durgeon is always going to have issues, and I am always going to hate Durgeon. I mentioned Durin having issues with Lunar Bloom because you have a burning aura, and you have to remove it with one Hydro application, and then generate your bloom with another Hydro application, and Durgeon has that exact same issue. The burning reaction sort of negates a few of your Hydro applications, which should be generating bloom cores, but aren't. They're simply there to remove the burning. So I pretty much just always run Durgeon teams as double Hydro. I think it is possible to go double Dendro and live off of just Xingqiu's application alone because, oh Jesus Christ, this boy has so much Hydro on him. But I will always prefer to go double Hydro for the ease of play. But yeah, Lauma here, she do bloom damage buffing, she applied Dendro, she shred Dendro res, does all those stupid things that she does for bloom. And then we got our two Hydras. We got Xingqiu, we got Aino, who Aino, this maybe isn't the best choice. Being a second Nod Cry, she brings you into Ascendant Moongleam, and while that does give you some gear options, like putting Xingqiu on Serenade, or probably I'm just gonna leave her on Serenade, it also changes Lauma's buff from crit rate and crit damage for bloom cores to crit rate and crit damage for lunar bloom talent damage, which we're not doing very much of in this team. We also are gonna have to pamper Lauma for the sustain. What the heck is going on there? While I don't think there are any particularly good Durgeon teams, Durin does make for one of the best triggers in the game, if not the best. Of course, he hits with Pyro once every second in a pretty sizable AoE in his light mode burst. Very, very good at triggering bloom cores and making them burgeons. And he has the potential to shred Dendro Res and make the blooms deal even more damage. And for Burgeon, we of course gotta switch up the build to my last unmentioned weapon because I didn't want to give away the surprise. Yep, Xiphos is very good weapon on him in Bloom, gives him some EM in his substats, and of course it converts EM to energy recharge, which he wants. Alright, enough screwing around, let's go. Alright, highest I can get it to go is 46k. Admittedly, Burgeon is not an archetype that I am the most well learned about, so there are probably almost definitely ways to kind of get around this. Definitely ways to configure your team to deal more damage. I know is probably not the best decision. Could be preferable to throw in a dedicated healer like Kokomi. Maybe you could get away with a Pamber and Nahida in this slot if Xingqiu's application is enough. Burgeon is a very, very weird and uncomfortable archetype, and I don't recommend it, but if you really want to play Burgeon, Durin's your best shot. Alright, enough with the real teams, if you really want to call Burgeon a real team. Now we got a few stupid things. Alright, now that we're done with the more structured talk, let me go over a few more teams that you can use supportive Durin in, just to give you some more ideas on what you can do with the character. Did you really think I was going to go the whole video without mentioning Wriothesley Burnmelt? Yeah, of course Durin does a decent amount for this team. He's shredding res for Emilie, and he's applying Pyro for both Wriothesley and Emilie. Given that I have his signature, he's also giving Wriothesley a little bit of an attack buff. I'm going to be replacing Albedo with Nicole soon enough. Right now, he's serving the same purpose that he did in the Kaniche team. He deals a little bit of his own damage, he doesn't mess with the reactions of the on-fielders, and he does a tiny bit of damage bonus buffing. Once Nicole comes out, I'll be getting an attack buff to the entire team, which will be a lot more impactful than what Albedo does, but he's a fine enough slot for now. This is actually a team where you might end up running Durin on the Hex supportive set instead of Albedo, but if you run Nicole, obviously she'll be the one on it. I mean, I don't know what's left to say about this team. I've covered it a lot before. It is one of my favorite teams. I'm always looking for ways to improve it. Pretty simple interactions going on here. This is actually one of the teams where you use Albedo's burst because of the EM that it gives. Really, the only notable new information is that a new teaser has been dropped that indicates maybe Ryze will be getting some buffs in the future, and hopefully they're Hexerai, and hopefully they're not some new faction, but I don't know, it seemed to be kind of a random smattering of units that showed up in that teaser. So surely this is why Wriothesley wasn't on the Chronicled Wish, because he's gonna get buffed and this team is gonna end up doing 300k DPS at C0 level investment. Surely they'll do that. Why would they do anything else? And yet another team I've probably mentioned a lot, but for the sake of thoroughness, boom, on-field Emilie. This is another team I've brought up in a few different videos, most recently my last one about Emilie. Funnily enough, this is one that will not be improved by Nicole, given how much of the team's damage is coming out of Emilie, given how useful Bennett's Pyro Infusion is to her, and given that Fischl can snapshot Bennett's buff, so Bennett is sort of a full party buffer in this team. He's not buffing Durin, but the value that he's giving to Emilie and Fischl compared to the value that Nicole would give, it just makes up for it. I just like this team a lot. I think it's funny. I think it shows the variety of what type of things Durin can be an upscale for. Yeah, you can use them in all those traditional teams like Overload, like Lunar-charged, like Geo teams with Navia. You can run them with Kaniche, or you can use them to enable silly things like on-field Emilie, which maybe sadly turns out to be a little bit better than Wriothesley. Granted, I did get Emilie's signature weapon, and Emilie's signature weapon is a pretty significant increase to this team, given how much of the damage she's doing. So haha, great funny team. And now the final supportive team we're going to look at. This one is certainly more of a fun one, but I think it shows off another fun archetype that Durin enables. Because he doesn't need to be on field to shred all the res that he wants to shred, you can get away with some pretty interesting teams that otherwise the setup wouldn't allow for them to work. So from the depths of my chat's mind, we have a Technari Sethos dual carry Durin team. Technari is on Reverie of all things. He technically is almost an entirely attack scaling character. Really, the only synergy with Spread is that he gets damage bonus from building EM, and he applies a lot of Dendro, and therefore can trigger a lot of spreads. But if you look at all of his scalings, they are entirely attack percent. There is no EM scaling talent damage in Technari's entire kit. Not that I say it's advisable to run him without Spread, but you can get away with doing it. In any case, let's just take a look at this. Again, not the most fantastic team. This is more just a team that I enjoy playing myself that I think shows off this concept fairly well. Because of Durin's simplicity and ease of getting his res shred, you are able to do a lot more funky things like this and still get pretty significant damage out of them. 60k DPS isn't game breaking or anything, but it's more than enough to get you through abysses that aren't actively hostile towards this team. This team actually does do a pretty decent job into chambers 1 and 2 of the first half of this abyss. It falls off a bit on the third chamber because Mandragora has a 300% Dendro resistance, I'm pretty sure. In any case, the abyss before this one with the Papillas, another very good abyss for this team. But yeah, it's cool, it's funky. Let's look at one final variation of a little quickswap team, and then we can get into the DPS Durin teams. Again, another team that isn't particularly game-breaking. It hovers around 80 to 85k DPS on my account. And I've got some SIGs. I've got Navia SIG, I just got Linny SIG, I got Durin SIG, I got Albedo on Spindle. This isn't a low investment version of this team by any means, and it doesn't even perform incredibly. But it's fun, it's interesting, I get to play a lot of units that I enjoy in a way that isn't particularly conventional. Again, Shilonen is a perfectly fine slot in place of Albedo here, although you probably are going to see a little bit of a decrease on the team's damage. But it's fun and it's good enough for most of the content that I'm interested in. This would probably be a pretty good team against all chambers of the first half of this abyss. Now let's look at DPS Durin. I only really have two variants here because boy oh boy, I don't play a whole lot of DPS Durin. So actually, as of right now, off-field Durin is very much not a complete team, even though Mona is another hex unit that enables the higher levels of Durin's buffs, and a lot of her buffs were geared towards making her an on-fielder for an off-field DPS Durin. Her normal attacks grant a full party damage bonus to Vaporize, she has a few buffs in her constellation that buff full party EM, she buffs reaction damage to off-fielders more than she does to on-fielders, she gives a little bit of crit damage to other Hexerai party members. There's just a lot in her kit that seems like she was meant to be a Vaporize on-fielder for a Durin off-field damage dealer, but of course she can do a lot of other things than just support Durin. She's also pretty good at being a Hydra unit for Durin doing lunar-charged stuff, but she seemed like she was kind of intended to be a little bit of a Durin driver as well. However, she's really not the best at it, and we are about to get a few significant upgrades to Durin's off-field DPS teams. Number one, of course, being Nicole. Durin doesn't have a way of getting an attack buff in these off-field DPS teams, which is why they don't do all that great. That is going to change with Nicole's release. She is going to make him deal a significant bit more damage there. And secondarily, even though Mona is a good Hydra unit, she applies enough Hydra, she gives bonuses to the Vaporize reaction. You'd think that you would want to be doing Vaporizes in off-field Durin teams, but the value of triggering a melt is just so much higher for a Pyro unit than triggering Vaporize, and Seatlali is such a good support for melt damage dealers that you usually just end up running melt anyways, and that means that against bosses, you can run into issues actually getting a proper aura for Durin to react off of, because when you trigger a freeze on a boss, instead of triggering freeze on them, it just removes both elements. But Durin is about to get Lohen, who replaces Mona in this team. He doesn't do as much buffing as Mona does, but he does a significant amount of damage himself, and he does a tiny bit of buffing, as well as he applies a stupid amount of cryo, and he doesn't make you mess around with the freeze reaction and potentially lose your auras. The combination of Lohen, who deals pretty reasonable on-field damage and applies cryo and buffs a little bit of attack, and Nicole, who does all the things that Nicole does for Durin, Durin's off-field DPS teams are about to get significantly better. But right now, the best I can do is Lolly, Farina, and a pambered Mona for healing. Oh yeah, I also mentioned that Mona normal attacks do give a team-wide vaporized damage bonus buff, but like I said, even though she gives all these buffs, Melt is just so much better of a reaction that you often just end up on-fielding Lolly anyways, so you can guarantee your cryo auras and actually get melts. Why is Melt that color in the reaction tracker? That looks so weird. Like I said, not the best team. I also didn't play it very well at all. I am not the biggest connoisseur of off-field Durin DPS. I'm not the biggest connoisseur of Durin DPS in general. Reasonable team that's about to get a lot better through the inclusion of some other units. Lolly is going to be the only one who survives the purge. Now let's do a little bit of on-fielding. And for that, all we have to do is swap out Lolly, kind of, but not really. So the fun thing about Durin is that he is a Pyro unit. He builds for Pyro damage bonus. He builds for attack. So when you give him a bunch of attack and a Pyro infusion, now suddenly his normals are also scaling off of the same things as his burst. Technically, this is Durin's highest cheating on-field team as of right now, but through my testing, I have found this to be unbelievably fake. A lot of on-field Durin teams are kind of unbelievably fake. On-field Durin applies a lot of extra Pyro because he spams his charged attacks. They do a decent amount of damage and hit fairly fast, and it becomes very, very easy to overtake any Hydro auras and stop getting vapes on him. So I tested around with this team a little bit, and occasionally it lined up, but it was very, very, very rare, and I don't think that this team will work in pretty much any content where the enemy is moving at all. In general, keeping Durin within Bennett's circle is just a bit of a headache, and sadly Nicole isn't going to be able to free Durin from this because, like I said, the Pyro infusion is pretty important. In any case, I decided to ease some of my headaches by trading out Mona for Fischl. Fischl has much lower field time. She grants pretty good buffs, not nearly as good as Mona's, but still pretty sizable. Up to 45% attack and 180 elemental mastery, which is both pretty useful for this team. And she does some pretty decent damage herself while being the hex unit that activates Durin's higher levels of buffs. Additionally, Mona doesn't apply very much Pyro, and Fischl's Electro would help preserve what little Hydro Farina is applying, because if you apply Pyro to an enemy that has an Electro and a Hydro aura, it will react with the Electro first, triggering an overload, and then only taking a little bit of the Hydro to trigger a Vaporize. In any case, I tested this out a little bit. It still wasn't very much better than Mona, but it was about the same level as Mona. And then I decided to trade out my Farina to someone with much more consistent consistent Hydra application, and I found that this team performed basically on par with how I could get my Mona Farina variant to perform. Much more free-to-play friendly and much more practical in my opinion. This is again another team I don't have very much practice with, so forgive the suboptimal play, but I find it very interesting that Xingqiu can completely make up for his entire lack of buffs just by applying enough Hydro so that Durin does consistently get reactions. This is what I found to be the most comfortable and consistently performing versions of all my on-field Durin teams. Nicole is pretty clearly going to make Durin a far better off-field damage dealer than on-field damage dealer when she comes out, given that is what he is meant to be. His on-field presence certainly isn't horrible, but giving all those buffs to a unit who was meant to be a dedicated on-fielder is likely going to be the move in every team that he's played in. Even just like replacing Lohan with Wriothesley in Durin's premium off-field DPS team is probably going to be a significant increase to anything you can do with on-field Durin. But it's a cool and fun gimmick, and for those of you who really like Durin and want to see his fun, flashy, normal attack animations, here you go. I wouldn't wholly recommend it, but it works well enough. And there you have it. Durin 101. Can't wait to make a follow-up in a week. Yippee, I'm not done talking about Durin, baby. But as for everything that I can talk about before Nicole comes out, I think that's it. And that is a lot of information. I'm a little bit scared to edit this video and see how long it's gonna end up being. Maybe I'll break a new record, who knows. Before I go, I have to thank my channel members. Najodo, Rumpaltas, Mudkip1727, Beef Potato, Roberto Desu, Big Soup, Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, TSI Amat, Mahosho Jaruru, Smooty, Starnova, Pop Roxy, Tay Rose, Tylee, Aqua, and we actually have gotten a new member since I slowed down video production, but thank you for supporting the channel, Minecraft Feet Pics, and of course the rest of you as well. Every extra bit of support that you can give is greatly appreciated, especially in this slower period where the channel wasn't doing as much. I really appreciate all you've done. I would like to thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.